Hi, and welcome to Module 6, Understanding Reading Deficits. In this module, we're going to really take a close look at what it means to have a reading deficit, especially in those adolescent ages, middle and high school. And then take a look at the different pieces of that, and then look at assessment, how assessment plays a role in really informing our instruction and how we provide students with instruction in reading, but also provide accommodations and modifications in those content-specific classes where reading can become a barrier. Now, your textbook really covered some great information on accommodations and kind of how to tackle a reading deficit. It provided some data on what a reading deficit kind of looks like and what the national average is. I want us to look at that a little bit closer. And then I want us to take a look at what are the steps to be a good reader and really walk through those for everything from fluency to decoding, to comprehension, so you have a really good picture in your mind of what an effective reader is, and then what are some of the barriers that students face when they aren't an effective reader, if they struggle with reading. I think that's going to really help you understand what your students can do in the classroom, what they're struggling with, and if we know what they're struggling with, it really allows us to pinpoint interventions that are going to be helpful. And then we're going to take a look at that assessment piece. That's one of the pieces the book didn't talk about a whole lot that I really want us to spend some time on is assessment and looking at that for reading in particular. So I love this quote from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, because this really gives us a good overall full encompassing understanding of what reading is, because reading is complicated. And that's why it is hard for some of our students to really learn to be effective, successful readers. This says reading is an active and complex process that involves understanding written text, developing and interpreting meaning, and using meaning as it's appropriate to text, purpose, and situation. Okay, so there's a number of pieces that play into this, and a number of areas that students can struggle with that then really affects their overall capability of reading, and that's what we really want to have a firm grasp on. I want to look at some trends in reading data. This is looking at 8th grade, and this is the NAEP, so they keep track of this each year and provide a lot of great information on how students are performing in reading. This is the national average. If we looked at Kansas, for example, most of you are in Kansas, it's going to be pretty close to the same here as this. Okay, so you can see we've got the basic scale score there of 245. Proficient score is at 280. Advanced score is at 310. Okay, or approximately around there. So you'll see the national average is 265 in 2015. Okay, the last time that we had data that we were looking at. 265, so that is below the proficient line there, and clearly average-wise since 92 we have been below that, and we've been pretty steady at the same level pretty much since 98. 98 was at 264. You can see we're at 265 now. It hasn't changed a whole lot. So the majority of students are performing below proficient. So what does proficient mean when we're looking at this? Well, this is how NAEP defines proficiency. It says that an 8th grade student that's proficient should be able to provide relevant information and summarize main ideas and themes. They should be able to make and support inferences about a text, connect parts of a text, and analyze text features. Students performing at this level should also be able to fully substantiate judgments about content and presentation of content. So that is a lot of skills if you think about it to be a proficient, right? But those are important skills when we're talking about content area learning, which is what we're looking at, especially in those secondary classrooms, content-specific learning. You have to be able to do these things to successfully learn that in print text. And so you can see that the majority of students, above 50% of our students, are going to struggle with that, not just our kiddos with special needs. So I want to look at the pieces that play into this, okay? We're going to look at all the different pieces of reading that have to be in place for students to successfully read. And the first one is decoding, okay? So decoding really just refers to the ability to decipher a word, okay, to break that word down. A lot of times you'll hear about phonemic awareness in phonics, okay, so being able to put those syllables together to create a word. So here's what successful readers do when it comes to decoding. They have strategies to figure out what an unknown word is. So they know what those sounds are, they know what those phonemes are, so that they can sound out a word, okay? They are able to make connections between letter patterns and sounds, and it helps them read better. And then they can break down those words they don't know by syllables, okay? The other thing that these students can do is they understand prefixes, suffixes, root words, so that they can break down a long word into something that's meaningful for them. Students that struggle with decoding may just be able to read single-syllable words, but really have difficulty decoding those longer multi-syllabic words. They may not have very good knowledge or strategies for how to really sound out a word. Okay, they haven't mastered those that phonemic awareness where they can break down the sounds of a word. Okay, break down the syllables and really be able to read that. I'll give you an example on kind of a larger scale in terms of how this could be difficult. Our daughter, who is in second grade, is hard of hearing, primarily deaf, so she can't hear all of the sounds that we make within words. And so to teach her how to read, we can't teach phonics because those sounds don't really make sense to her when she's breaking down a word. So she's primarily learning to read from memory. That's hard if you think about it, being able to just see a word and know it on sight. Now we have sight words, right, that students use and learn in elementary school, but that's not how we traditionally learn how to read moving forward and being successful readers as adults, is not through sight word memory. And so it can be really challenging for our students if they don't have this foundation of phonemic awareness. The other way that students that struggle with phonics can really impact their comprehension skills, impacts their vocabulary and their reading fluency. So if you're reading slower because you're having trouble sounding out the words, it impacts your comprehension, okay? So therefore it's impacting that fluency. Here's an interesting fact for you as well. There's a link to some text that I've pulled a lot of this out of in the module that I think you'll find really helpful. But one of the things the author talked about was at grade 5, students typically encounter 10,000 or more new words a year in their grade level and content area texts. Okay? Most of these 10,000 words that they're going to encounter are multi-syllabic. So think about that. You're a struggling reader. Every year you're getting exposed to about 10,000 new words in your content-specific classes, and you don't have the foundation to sound out and decode those words. So it's going to be a real struggle. So you can see how that slide of struggling continues to get worse. So this is important to know because it's something that we can address. So how can we teach decoding skills? Okay, this probably sounds like reading instruction to you. It's not something we've typically done historically in high schools, right, or middle schools, is go back to these building block basics. But it's important. And even though adolescents may have that gap, you can have a big impact in them if you go back to this phonemic awareness and really target it for those students who struggle with decoding skills. Okay, so this is a great thing to do during resource room instruction or maybe during a small group pullout in a content area to integrate some of these decoding skills within that content area instruction. So here are some ways that we can do it. Okay, how do we integrate it in the classroom? Well, we can take time before the lesson begins to really determine what are those content area specific words that the students may struggle with and pull those out and introduce those words. Introduce them by teaching them the syllables of the word. For example, ecosystem, helping them sound that out. Ecosystem, okay? Pausing at each one so they hear that syllable. They start to make that connection, okay, of how that word's broken down. You can also help them point out patterns in the pronunciation and spelling of those prefixes, suffixes, those kinds of things, okay? Modeling use of new or difficult words in a different context. So if you've got those words that you know they're going to struggle with or you know could be a little bit challenging for their decoding skills, give them lots of examples of how to use that word in lots of different contexts. Allow students to answer oral questions using those words. So they're reading the word, they're seeing the word, they're saying the word a lot. So they're really getting a lot of interaction with that word. The other thing you can do is give students just some collaborative time with each other to kind of practice those strategies of sounding out those words. So I think it's important to realize that even though these are high school students, middle school students that we may be working with, it's really important that we are providing them with that direct, systemic, explicit instruction on decoding. Okay, and that's something that probably doesn't always, it's not always our first thought when we have a student that's having a reading difficulty or maybe a learning disability in reading, or their reading level is pretty far behind their peers. But it's really important that we continue to hone in on those decoding skills and give them that real direct instruction on how to do that. Okay, so fluency is the other big thing that can affect our students in the secondary classroom, right? What is fluency? Well, fluency is really how quickly we read, how quickly we decode, okay? So successful readers are going to read between 100 and 160 words per minute at the middle school level, okay? Kind of depending on the text they have. So they're kind of fluidly decoding those words as they go along. You know, they may run into 1 out of every 10 words they don't know, and they're sounding it out, but they're doing that pretty quickly, and it's not affecting their comprehension at all, okay? So as they're doing that in their fluency, they're reading, they're understanding, they're interpreting what that instruction is, what that text is telling them, okay? So struggling readers, when it comes to fluency, they kind of look like they're working hard to read. You know what I mean? It's not coming natural. They're really looking at those words. They're thinking about what letters are in them. They're trying to make those sounds. They're running into a lot of words that are hard for them, that they're having to sound out, and so it's slow going, right? And they're probably still struggling with some of those decoding skills that are impacting their fluency. Sometimes one of the interesting things to notice with kiddos who struggle to read is they may not pause at punctuation, so they just keep going, okay? If they're reading out loud, you don't hear any kind of real emotion in their voice, or you know, you can't. It's just a consistent level of voice that they're using. You don't see them picking up on those emotions within the text, and then it's really going to limit their comprehension. Okay, because fluency is just critical for that. One of the big things that helps with fluency, and this is something that sometimes, especially our older students, can be resistant to, is repeated oral reading. It can just be really beneficial to those older students. Sometimes that's a good thing to do one-on-one if they're not comfortable reading in front of the group. Or if you want them to maybe read in front of the class or read in front of a small group, have them practice separately beforehand and then come in and do it, so that maybe they're a little bit more comfortable with the text that they're reading. Just frequent exposure to readings, learning new words, learning new vocabulary, really giving them a lot of supervised practice is going to help them improve their fluency skills. Okay, vocabulary. This is a big one, and this is probably one of the areas that in our content-specific classes we do tend to address a little bit more than the others, because we do have very content-specific vocabulary that we want all students to learn, right? But kind of here's what we see with successful readers versus non-successful or struggling readers when we're talking about vocabulary, okay? So successful readers, they've been exposed to a lot of vocabulary, a lot of words in conversation. They've seen a lot of print at home. They've seen a lot of print at school. From a really early age, they're developing that vocabulary, okay? They understand 90% of the words they're reading. And they learn words pretty quickly, okay? Multiple exposures to new word, but then they've got it. They've got it in their repertoire of words that they know. And they can really connect those words to their prior knowledge, okay? So how does it come into context with what they're reading about now? What have they read about in the past that included that vocabulary term? So struggling readers are going to have more limited exposure to new words. So they're not reading as much. They're not reading at home as much. They didn't have access to a lot of print at an early age. Maybe didn't have a lot of that back and forth communication, you know, that's so important at an early age. And they may just not enjoy reading, so it doesn't They don't read as much, and they're not developing that vocabulary. The other thing is that they can really have trouble comprehending because they struggle with those new words that they're coming across in their reading and what those words mean. Okay, and that's just from a lack of experience and exposure. I mean, vocabulary is one of those things that's just going to develop from reading a lot. And a lot of times you see struggling readers maybe have limited content-specific prior knowledge. So this is where those content area teachers can really help build and connect that vocabulary to prior learning experiences and really build up that content-specific vocabulary that the student has. A couple of interesting things to note. The average 12th grader who is prepared to go to college knows about 80,000 words. Okay, that's a lot of exposure to text, a lot of exposure to oral language. So that can really just kind of give you an idea of how this develops. The other thing that I think it's important to remember here in vocabulary is it kind of goes back to that old saying, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. It's the same way with reading. The more you read, the more you're exposed to words, the better reader you're going to be, the more vocabulary you're going to have. That's just kind of the way it is. Sometimes it's hard, though, to really get students motivated to read, right? So they build up that vocabulary. So we're going to look at motivation here in a little bit. But there are some things that you can do to really help students build their vocabulary. You can provide these exposure to words that really develop deep understanding, okay? There's really 3 tiers of words that we have when we're reading, okay? We've got tier 1 words which students are likely to know, like happy, I'm sad, or even words as simple as and, okay? Then we've got tier 2 words that appear frequently but in many contexts. So, for example, compromise or regardless, okay, at the high school level. They may run across those words in multiple content areas, right? And then we've got tier 3 words that are rarely in text. They're super content specific. So, for example, if you've got a kiddo in biology class, biogenetics, okay, that's a tier 3 word. You're not going to run across that word very often. So one of the things that reading interventionists talk about is focusing on those tier 2 words and really building up those words that happen in a lot of different contexts, okay? The other thing that we can do is really teach students multiple meanings of words. So helping them understand that is really critical. Trying to think of an example for multiple meanings of words. Okay, here's one. I was trying to explain to my daughter, who's deaf, about boarding the bus. Okay, the word board the bus. And she knows the word board. She knows how to spell it, and her dad works a lot does woodworking. She thinks a board is a piece of wood. And so that word has 2 different meanings for her. Now, but as we were learning the signs for both of those, she fingerspelled them the same, but they had different meanings, so they had different signs. And so that's just an example of how it's really important for kids who struggle with vocabulary to really understand those multiple meanings of words. We can do lots of things to engage students in learning vocabulary. We can have students help us create definitions. We can have them draw pictures of what they think the word means, okay? Even high school kids can enjoy this, getting into sketching it. We can play games with words. There are lots of different tools online that we can use, websites. There's a couple within this module that you can take a look at that just give you a variety of ways of interacting with a word. So, for example, there is a definition website on the module that allows you to look up a word, gives you the definition, gives you a little video that also includes kind of an animation that helps you remember that word, and then it gives you a sentence for how you would use that word. So it's just giving them exposure to that word in a variety of ways, which is really helpful. Okay, comprehension. Comprehension, this is a tough one, right, for our secondary kids as well. So comprehension is just understanding what we're reading, right? Being able to make inferences from what we're reading, being able to summarize what we're reading, being able to answer questions after we've read something. and really regurgitate that information back, right? It's comprehension. So how do successful readers do that? Well, they monitor their reading for understanding, okay? So they're interacting with the text. They're thinking about what they've read. They're putting it in context of what they know. They're linking it to prior knowledge, right? They're using a lot of different strategies as they're doing it. For example, I've noticed my son as he is getting into chapter books, and some of his chapter books maybe have a picture in it. So he struggles with a few words, but I can see him, looking at that picture, making sure he's comprehending compared to what the picture says and what he's reading in the text, that it's matching up. Okay? Successful readers are also able to really set a purpose for their reading, okay, and adjust their strategies based on what that purpose is. So if I have chapter questions I'm answering for my science class, I think, okay, I know what the purpose is of reading this chapter. This is my guide, my questions. I know how to pinpoint and answer those questions by what I'm reading in the text, okay? So struggling readers, and there's a lot of things that can play into struggling with comprehension, okay? One of the things that can play into this is fluency. So just being able to read in a way that fosters comprehension. So if you're reading really slowly, if you're having trouble breaking down words and decoding words, it's going to affect your comprehension, okay? You're going to be spending so much energy on that decoding that you can't spend energy on comprehending what you're reading. A lot of times kids don't have the strategies either to really make that connection in, okay, what I'm reading, what I'm learning from this new text compared to what we learned yesterday or what we learned last week. How do I make those connections to my prior knowledge, right? And they don't have those strategies in place to do that. They may also not have the strategies in place, for example, like the example I gave you about the chapter questions, to say, okay, how do I do that? How do I read this text and answer these chapter questions? What strategies do I have in place? Okay. For example,